Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Who are the greatest threats to censorship today?
I think we're seeing a full-scale attack on free speech by governments around the world. And we're starting to detect more of the linkages between those governments. We had long suspected that, but obviously wanted to get the evidence before making any accusations. But we now see that the European Union is clearly working with all of its member nations to crack down on free speech. Ireland has been a hotspot. Scotland's a hotspot. We see now Brazil had involvement from the FBI and a similar set of philanthropic actors as well. George Soros being the most high profile, but also Pura Midyar. And we also see Craig Newmark Foundation has been funding a lot of these efforts that then governments come in with additional funding to support. So it's clearly a worldwide effort by governments to attempt to regulate or censor what people are saying on social media platforms.
Which individuals would you say are the worst censors at the moment around the world?
I mean, the person that stands out in Europe is Thierry Breton. He's the head of enforcement for the Digital Services Act, which is the name of the legislation in Europe that gives the EU this incredible amounts of power to control social media, to censor social media. So I would say he'd be at the top of the list. But you see bad actors everywhere. In Brazil, it's President Lula and the Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. In Canada, it's Justin Trudeau. In I would say in Ireland and Scotland, it's the Prime Minister and the First Minister. But happily, both of them have recently resigned, in part due to controversy around their censorship legislation, which they call hate speech legislation. So it's really coming from the heads of state, I would say. And Brazil's a slight exception in that you have the judiciary so involved.
What about in the United States?
In the United States, President Biden has continued to pursue so-called anti-disinformation efforts that are censorship efforts. Mostly had been done through the Department of Homeland Security. When he announced a disinformation governance board in the spring of 2022, there was a huge backlash with people calling it a George Orwellian or Orwellian ministry of truth. The person that was supposed to head that up, named Nina Jankowicz, is now out with a new organization that is ostensibly about her getting revenge, if I were to be blunt about it, but basically attacking critics of censorship. So it's an anti-disinformation effort, so to speak.
Now, you mentioned Justin Trudeau earlier. What kind of efforts are going on in Canada in terms of hate speech, censorship, and things like that?
There's new legislation in Canada by Trudeau's Liberal Party that is truly shocking. It would allow for a life sentence in prison for things that people say. I believe in that case it's Holocaust denial, which I agree is a horrible thing, but the idea that you would go to prison for it is absolutely absurd. In the U.S., the tradition is that we allow Nazis to speak. We have a very strong free speech legislation. Not only are Nazis allowed to speak, they're allowed to march through neighborhoods of Holocaust survivors. That was a very famous ruling in 1977 for a city called Skokie, Illinois, inspired by an earlier ruling in Ohio called Brandenburg. So we have a very high standard, but even in countries where there are prohibitions on Holocaust denial, nothing of that severity has ever been proposed before.
Who represents a greater threat to freedom of speech? Is it governments or is it private companies?
I think it's driven by governments. I think the governments are in the driver's seat. The private companies are enabling it. It's really often through the large corporate advertisers. So think of Disney, think of the big global advertisers. They want to protect their brands from associations with things they don't like. And to some extent, I think that's understandable. But they get captured by activist groups, activist NGOs, as well as NGOs funded by governments, such as NewsGuard, in order to impose a censorship regime. But I think the leadership that you're seeing, it's clearly coming from what you might call the deep state, the administrative state, agencies like the Department of Homeland Security. But you also see parliamentarians around the world that are heavily involved in this. So you do see a combined effort really from executive branch, legislative branch, and in the case of Brazil, from the judiciary. But really, I do think it's the state that's been driving it, and often with foreign policy objectives. I think it's fair to characterize the main motivation for the censorship being a motivation of counter-populism that really was that began before, but really went on steroids after the two revolutions of 2016, Brexit, then the election of Trump. And then in 2018, with the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, I think that elites, the deep state, continued its freak out and decided that it really had to get control over social media.
Let's dive into that a little bit. So you're saying that governments around the world are concerned that populist parties may succeed, and therefore they're turning to what? What weapons are they using to prevent that from happening?
Well, one of the first step has been media monitoring. And to some extent, that sounds innocuous. Politicians and government officials have long had staff to monitor what's going on in the media. And you can see why. What's in the media often determines the window in which politicians are able to operate, what they're able to get done legislatively. They'll take some amount of risks do some unpopular things to get legislation through, but not so unpopular that they'll lose their jobs. So they engage in heavy media monitoring. But during COVID, for example, in Britain, we saw the military involved in monitoring social media platforms. So it first extended beyond what was being done in political offices to military security and intelligence agencies. And then it also expanded to social media. So they weren't just monitoring what somebody wrote for the New York Times or the Times of London. They were monitoring what Joe Smith wrote out of Dublin or London or Cincinnati or any part of the world. And they would be trying then to snuff out whole narratives. So there's been a double game played here. On the one hand, the official discourse is, we just want to protect people from getting inaccurate information, like on when the voting day is, for example. But what they, in their own materials, and when I say they, I'm referring to censorship industrial complex leaders in the United States and in Britain and in Europe and around the world, they say we're trying to snuff out whole narratives. What are these narratives? These are narratives that question the legitimacy of the state to do particular activities, whether it's lockdowns or vaccine mandates or censoring election information. And so you see them constantly widening the mandate. The other dynamic I would point to is that they first started saying, well, we're just out to focus on foreign disinformation. We just want to stop Russian disinformation. And then they said, well, it turns out that a lot of the disinformation is coming from domestic audiences. And so one of the New York Times headline about one of the censorship leaders in the United States, Renee DiResta, the headline was something like, she fights peer-to-peer misinformation. Well, you're just now talking about conversations between citizens, and that extended to people's messaging apps in Brazil, where the government imposed heavy regulations on the ability to share information across WhatsApp.
In terms of the effectiveness of this censorship towards achieving that political goal of ending populist movements or kind of trying to restrict them or restrict their growth, how successful have governments been?
Well, it's a really interesting question because, of course, on the one hand, our opponents, the people that want censorship, have a number of big advantages. They have control over governments. They have large staffs. They can make large grants to NGOs and organizations. They can ask their philanthropic partners like George Soros and Pierre Omidyar to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, really billions of dollars over time on various NGOs to create lists of people that should be banned and to try to demand that the terms of service of social media companies be changed and to be demanding that certain things and certain narratives be censored. So they've just got a huge apparatus that we don't have anything nearly approaching. What's going against them is a couple of things. I think the first thing is the Streisand effect. The Streisand effect is named after that because there's a famous photo that was taken from a helicopter of Barbra Streisand's home on the coast of California. Nobody had seen the photo until she sued to take the photo off the internet. And then afterwards, millions of people went to visit her photo. So when they achieve censorship of some particular issue, it is a story, and it is a big story, I think, obviously. And so that does find a way to get itself out. So on our side is the Streisand effect. I think the second thing is that even though you have seen growing support on the left, particularly among Democrats in the United States, for government involvement in censorship, I do think we still have a strong free speech culture on the West. And it takes a while for those things to change. Part of the reason I'm so alarmed is that the percentage of Americans that say that the government should be involved in fighting online information, meaning through censorship, rose from 40% of Democrats to 70% of Democrats between 2018 and 2023. That's a very alarming trend. And I think there's no question that that was being driven by all of this media propaganda, that it was misinformation that got Trump elected. So Democrats who really hate Trump were convinced by the news media that the reason Trump was elected was because he was spreading misinformation. And so the sense was, well, the government should be involved in fighting that misinformation, really for partisan reasons. But I do think it's also important to remember that obviously 30% of Democrats disagree with that. Republicans, who had traditionally been the weaker party in support of free speech, have become much stronger. And then I do think what we've seen around the country, around the world, is that simply describing this as censorship and calling it what it is has itself changed the conversation. So in Brazil, when we did the Twitter Files Brazil, I was pilloried by the media for like 5 days. But after really the day I left, the two biggest newspapers wrote editorials against censorship. So you can see, even though there'll be a lot of kind of crying and complaining by the news media and government officials that really we should be able to fight misinformation, once you call it censorship and you draw that issue out, related to the Streisand effect, once you have the public argument about it, I think people kind of look at it and they go, we don't want to go down that road.
In terms of intelligence agencies getting involved in censorship, what have we seen in recent years? Can you talk about how they're involved in this world?
Well, probably the best place to start is with the FBI's foreign intelligence, the Foreign Influence Task Force, or the FITF. That's one of the first things we started seeing coming out in the Twitter files. So after Elon Musk bought Twitter took over Twitter after buying it in the fall of 2022, he opened up the files to a number of journalists. I was one of them. And what we discovered were a lot of requests by FBI officials suggesting that certain people were foreign influenced. And then we would often see Twitter getting back to FBI and saying, we don't really see the foreign influence. This is just an American saying that. Around the same period, then you started to see, really around 2017, 2018, you started to see this conversation of, oh, well, really the misinformation is coming from within the domestic audience. You started to see an actual disinformation campaign by government-funded think tank that was called Hamilton 68. And it was a website that supposedly had evidence of foreign influence. But when Twitter looked at it, they discovered that it was really just people, not just in the United States, by the way, also in Britain, ordinary citizens who were expressing concerns. And you still see it to this day, where you see governments attempting to sort of, we saw recently the Czech intelligence agencies, the Polish intelligence agencies, European Union officials saying, oh, that we're seeing a Russian disinformation campaign. But it was clearly electioneering, attempting to discredit a increasingly popular right-wing party in Germany called AfD, a very controversial party. It's not a party that, I think a lot of people, a lot of liberal people don't support it, obviously. But the claims that it's functionally a Russian-funded organization, I think, has to be viewed as a disinformation effort, one that's being carried out by European politicians, who I think it's fair to say are weaponizing their intelligence agencies for political reasons. We got the European elections coming up for the European Parliament on June 9th, and it's impossible not to see this campaign as related to some sort of election interference.
It's so interesting because in the BBC, for example, they have 60 reporters on disinformation, the BBC Verify team, they call themselves. And recently I did some reporting with GB News where we found that BBC employees themselves were spreading conspiracy theories on the BBC's own platforms, internal platforms. Someone leaked this information to us and the BBC's Verify team were nowhere to be heard. Right. So there seems to be an issue of journalists themselves definitely treating disinformation in a partisan, warped way, and perhaps then even pushing censorship as well as governments and private companies.
I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, is that the censorship almost always comes with disinformation. So one of the most famous examples was just vaccines. It was disinformation that the vaccines would stop infection or prevent transmission. It did neither of those things, obviously, and yet they continued to make that claim, and then they demanded censorship of people who raised legitimate concerns about the ability of the vaccines to do that. I hasten to add, I actually support the vaccines. I was vaccinated myself. It clearly does it reduces death rates. I think that is an important achievement, but you nonetheless saw this misinformation being spread with an accompanying demand for censorship. Similarly, on the lab leak, we saw misinformation coming from top government scientists in the United States claiming that there was no evidence for the lab leak and that it was a completely outrageous conspiracy theory. That was misinformation, and it was disinformation, meaning intentional misinformation, because the people that were spreading it knew very well that it could have been a lab leak. And then they demanded censorship by the social media platforms. We just got a new piece of information a few days ago, which is early May. I think it's May 1st even, where Mark Zuckerberg, we have an email now from Mark Zuckerberg, the owner of Facebook, to one of his colleagues saying, we should note that the White House pressured us to censor the lab leak story, which they did. So now a majority of Americans think that the lab leak is a more likely, and I agree, a more likely cause of the pandemic than the spillover natural hypothesis. But those are two, I think, very concrete examples where we saw people spreading disinformation and then demanding censorship on the basis of that disinformation.
You mentioned Mark Zuckerberg there. How would you compare his approach to freedom of speech to that of Elon Musk's?
Mark Zuckerberg took, I think, a principled and good position in 2017 after he was being accused, it's important to remember, first accused of causing Brexit and then second accused of causing the election of Trump. Most political scientists don't agree with that. They never did. Most political scientists think that Trump won the Republican nomination because he outperformed his competitors in the debates, and that he defeated Hillary for a variety of reasons, but mostly because he increased the turnout in swing states, really on the basis of economic populism. So the idea that Trump won the elections because of Facebook is itself a conspiracy theory with no evidence for it and a significant amount of evidence against it. Yet that was the dominant argument being made by government-funded NGOs and NGOs that work with intelligence agencies, and by, frankly, a number of government officials. At first, he was very principled about it. He said, that's absurd. Obviously, we didn't decide the election. And he also defended a very strong free speech standard, saying that even though he's Jewish, that he supported allowing Holocaust denial on a Facebook platform. There was a relentless and very powerful and very effective coordinated effort to break his will, and it was done by all the same NGOs that have been attacking Elon Musk since he bought X. Top of the list is Media Matters, but also the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a group with origins in Britain. And it's worth noting that the US-British relationship here is very strong on both sides, both censorship and free speech. And unfortunately, Mark Zuckerberg first caved in to the censors, but then he basically has throttled news content on the Facebook website. So news doesn't really go viral in the ways that it did a few years ago. When Elon Musk took over and has had the same attitude as Mark Zuckerberg, but has not had his will broken, we can talk about why that is, but I think that I think the record is very good for Elon and only getting better with his recent actions in Brazil.
How important was that moment when Elon took over Twitter in terms of freedom of speech around the world?
I mean, I think it was a huge moment for a lot of different reasons. First, you had somebody that had a source of wealth that didn't come from the social media platforms themselves. So Elon's real wealth is in Tesla, his car company, and SpaceX, his rocket company, and soon in Starlink, his satellite internet company. Those are three very profitable businesses that made him the wealthiest man in the world. So when he took over Twitter, he overpaid for it by about threefold, according to him. It's never going to make any significant money. It's almost entirely a philanthropic venture at this point. I'm not suggesting that he won't use it to advance his business interests, and that's something that people should be vigilant about. But nonetheless, he's somebody that has shown a commitment to free speech. He then opened up the internal Twitter files with basically no restrictions on our ability to access the internal information of the company. Other than that, we simply publish it first on X rather than any other platform. But I think the real test has come over the last year and a half. We've seen, in particular, him standing up to the hate speech legislation in Ireland in other countries, and then most recently in Brazil, where it was my release of the Twitter files Brazil information 3 days later that inspired him to basically stand up to the Supreme Court justice that was demanding mass censorship.
Let's talk about what happened in Brazil recently. For those who don't know, can you just explain the story?
Sure. So Brazil has a number of eerie similarities to the United States. It first has a populist nationalist named Bolsonaro, who becomes elected president in 2018. There's a very similar counter-populist reaction to him by very similar figures, including by a number of Soros-funded NGOs that have received over $100 million of financing at this point from Soros. So that was the first thing. And then what happened was I had a long-standing relationship to Brazil. I lived there 30 years ago. I was going back down to give a speech on free speech. And some of two of my colleagues who are journalists in Brazil asked me if I would look through the Twitter files Brazil and see if I could find anything about Brazil. And I thought I had looked before, but I took a closer, harder look, and I discovered some pretty shocking information, including that there were demands by this particular Supreme Court justice, who has found himself with an extraordinary amount of power, not just from the Supreme Court, but also because he controls something called the Superior Electoral Commission, which has a lot of power to censor so-called misinformation about elections. So we discovered that he was demanding the unmasking of the identities of people who use certain hashtags, that he was demanding the permanent banning or deplatforming of independent journalists and politicians from Twitter for content they had posted on other social media platforms. That's more extreme than anything we had seen until then. I mean, the Donald Trump deplatforming was it's up there. It's a very radical and wrong decision, and one that the CEO later regretted. But nonetheless, and it was all secretive, is the other thing. This was all happening in secret. So we published the Twitter files Brazil. 3 days later, X, now formerly Twitter, publishes a statement saying they'd been getting all of these outrageous demands for censorship, because our files, of course, were a year and a half old at that point, but it was still ongoing. And then a few hours later, Elon Musk said that he was going to basically stand up against the censorship and unblock all these different people. There's been some back and forth since then. Elon would like to, he says he would like to stay in Brazil. The company, is a huge market, and also it's the only free speech platform in Brazil. So if you lose X, you lose free speech in Brazil. So they do want to stay. There's been some back and forth, but mostly we've seen Elon hold strong against this character, and has had a mostly positive impact in Brazil. There's obviously been a very defensive reaction by the president and the Supreme Court justice, but we've also seen the media come out more strongly for free speech, and more recently leaks to the media about the concern that these government officials have about being in this fight with Elon Musk. I think in the arc of the universe, so to speak, you might get some victories for the censorship folks, but I think the arc of the universe is still bending towards free speech, and that as the dust settles after these fights, I think people look around and say, we'd really rather have free speech than not have it. And it's bad politics for politicians to be demanding censorship.
How did they react to you specifically when you broke this story in terms of the Brazilian press, the Brazilian government, and so on?
I was basically attacked by the Brazilian media for 5 days, and it was incredibly one-sided. Honestly, some of it was just disinformation. The allegation was that there was an international conspiracy that I was involved with Elon Musk. It's funny because, of course, I didn't tell Elon Musk I was publishing the Twitter files Brazil. We had no interaction about it behind the scenes. He was reacting, as is often the case, publicly to the posts on X that I had put out there. After that occurred, the other thing that occurred is that since I had interviewed the current president of Brazil 30 years ago when I was a very young journalist and activist, I had asked him point blank if he was intending to engage in the kind of censorship that they use in Cuba. He, on the one hand, back in the early 90s, was a big fan of Cuba and its socialist system.
And you asked him that in the 90s?
I asked him that in 1994, point blank, in an interview. And I had all the photographs from the meeting still. And so I wrote about it on X, and then also for my Substack, describing this encounter and saying he had promised me that he wouldn't censor. So I'm pretty confident that the president saw that and didn't like it. A few days after returning to the United States in late April, there was two federal police reports in Brazil that described the so-called conspiracy that I was a part of, and it included a description of the Twitter files Brazil. That's like the FBI of Brazil writing two reports about you. It's a fairly alarming thing to see. The best part that I will say was that the image on my X profile says defund the thought police. So I had a nice chuckle that here inside the thought police's reports is something saying defund the thought police. It's such an absurd allegation, and it's not even obvious what law they think I broke, that I didn't really worry about it. But then a few days later, the Attorney General of Brazil issued a report basically saying that I was under criminal investigation and suggesting that I should be prosecuted. And the laws they were describing, like one of them either doesn't exist or they misrepresented it, which was the destabilization of the state. The only law against the destabilization of the state in Brazil is violent destabilization of the state, which obviously publishing Twitter posts is not violent. And it's worth pointing out because everyone says in Brazil, they say, well, your First Amendment standard is so much higher than ours. That's true, but they also have a very clear provision in the Brazilian constitution that there should be no censorship of political, ideological, and artistic statements, of which mine are. I should also say that the Brazilian constitution extends to foreigners the exact same protections it extends to Brazilians. So there's not some loophole where they can persecute me because I happen to be an American.
You don't seem like a violent man to me, but I don't know, maybe behind the scenes.
I'm committed publicly to nonviolence and always have been.
Are you worried about being arrested if you go to Brazil?
If they decide to bring charges against me in Brazil, I will go and defend myself in Brazilian courts. I believe in free speech, and I believe that it's important to stand up against totalitarians and people with clearly totalitarian and authoritarian instincts. And that would be what I would intend to do in Brazil. And I would suffer the consequences as need be. But I believe that the cause is righteous, and that if I'm going to be a free speech advocate and journalist for free speech, I've got to walk the walk. And so I would go to Brazil and defend myself.
In terms of other countries around the world, where are you concerned about with rising dangers and threats to freedom of speech and censorship?
I'm most worried about the European Union, and simply because of its outsized size and influence. There's 500 million people in the European Union. It's the largest economic bloc in the world. You've got a character there named Thierry Breton, who was the finance minister of France, is a close advisor to President Emmanuel Macron. The French have the most authoritarian attitudes culturally towards speech. It's really quite the United States and Britain are much closer, but even Britain has lower protections for free speech, but France has even lower protections than that. You may remember during the anti-police riots that broke out in France last year, there was a memo that somebody had reported on that described a secret plan by the government to censor or even shut down social media and internet during riots. The government said it was disinformation, then came out a few days later and said that it was actually true, and that was what the plan was and remains to be the plan. So I'm very concerned by, and I say this is somebody that really loves France and loves what the president has done with things like nuclear, which is a technology I support very strongly. But nonetheless, I am worried about the growing French influence in the EU. But the Germans as well are very authoritarian when it comes to these issues. So I worry that, especially with Britain out of the EU, that the French and the Germans will impose an agenda of censorship that would affect not just Europe, but the whole world, since it would be easier to just apply these censorship standards rather than to geolocate them.
In terms of limits to freedom of speech, where do you stand principally? I know in terms of your principles, Nick Fuentes, for example, may be allowed back on Twitter, according to Elon Musk.
Who is
Nick Fuentes?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that neo-Nazis should be allowed to be on Twitter and Facebook and things like that?
I do. I think that my views, in some ways, I think are very mainstream and banal in the U.S. context. So I support the Supreme Court ruling on Skokie, which was a ruling that allowed the neo-Nazis to march through a neighborhood of Jewish Americans that was disproportionately Holocaust survivors, or at least I should say had a lot of Holocaust survivors. Same thing with Brandenburg in Ohio in the 60s. So in my view, it's both a principled view in that I think that free speech, you're only committed to free speech if you're committed to free speech for people you don't like and whose speech you disagree with. I do also have a practical objection in that I believe that the ways in which we overcome both hate speech and misinformation is through conversation and argument. I would like to defeat Nazis in a public debate. I would like to humanize Jews and Black Americans and all the other people that Nazis say they hate. You can't do that if you repress Nazis. Allow the Nazis to speak. I mean, people will find it offensive and noxious and awful, I believe. And if you think someone's hiding their racism, well, then call them out on it and have that conversation. You know, I point out that I've written 2 books over the last 4 years, each with 400 pages, 100 pages of which are endnotes with references. They are books that are attacking misinformation. This is what I do as a journalist and author. I attack misinformation. I'm obsessed with it. I love doing it. I like to have the debate. It has never in my life crossed my mind that my opponents should be censored by the U.S. government. That is it's literally, it's inconceivable that would be a good idea. I would defend to my death the right of my opponents to say all of their erroneous and hateful things precisely so that we can argue back against them. We got to where we are in history with extraordinary amounts of freedom and acceptance of racial minorities, sexual minorities, political minorities, because people fought and died for free speech. And I'm very committed to maintaining that legacy and continuing it. We need to revitalize it. In some ways you say, who are the biggest enemies? As politicians, we can name them. I'm very concerned by young people that are in colleges that are confused, deeply confused for some reason, because of social media probably, between the difference between actions and words. You are allowed to say hateful, awful things. You can't stop Jewish kids or Palestinian kids from walking across the campus, nor can you, here's the limits. It's not legal and should not be legal to threaten somebody with physical violence. And it is against the law to do that. It's so that's where you draw the line. It's really immediate incitement to violence. There's other forms of restrictions on, like, I can't lie to steal your money. That's fraud. I can't deliberately lie about you to destroy your career. That's defamation, although the standard is much higher in the United States than in Britain, as I think it should be. And then immediate incitement to violence. I don't think it's that complicated. I think people are trying to suggest it's more complicated or that the line is more fuzzy than it is. I think it's pretty obvious the difference between saying hateful things and immediately inciting violence against somebody in the flesh.
And isn't it why you can't shout fire in a movie theater or something? Is that one of the ones?
You know, that turned out to be more complicated than people think. I mean, there are a lot of circumstances where you could yell fire in a theater. In some ways, it's a misinterpretation of what I think a better way to think of it is just the immediate incitement to violence. The Nazis can march through a neighborhood of Jewish Americans. You can't say, hey, everybody, let's go light the house on fire, or hey, everybody, let's go kill that person. That's clearly where the line is drawn. And it's a great place to have the line. I think everybody should understand that that's where the line is.
What about people who are actively trying to undermine democratic institutions or Western society, who advocate for, I don't know, radical Islam or monarchy or Nazism or whatever?
Of course, I think you should allow people to advocate for dictatorships or fascism or communism. Yes, please, go ahead, advocate for those things. You want the caliphate? Please, make the case as well as you can.
And if they succeed and they shut you down, what do you do then?
If they succeed, how?
If they win the election, for example, or if there's a revolution and so on.
I mean, then obviously, that would be awful. And then we're in a dictatorship, but that's kind of that's where it appears the elites are taking us right now. I mean, I defend freedom of speech, whether it's against radical Islamicists or radical progressives or radical conservatives. Defend free speech. It's only a defense of free speech if it's for people that you really dislike or that you really disagree with. But that means, yes, we allow people to argue for different forms of government. We allow people think sometimes that it's illegal to lie. It's actually only illegal to lie in a very narrow set of circumstances around fraud and defamation. But if you were to make lying illegal, then really the entire population would be criminally guilty. So there's a wonderful book that just came out from a legal scholar called Liar in a Crowded Theater that directly addresses this issue and points out all the very few restrictions that we still put on speech.
Where did your interest in free speech come from? Have you always been fascinated about this throughout your whole life? And it sounds like, you even asked Lula back in 1994 this question, so you must have had an interest back then.
Well, it's worth pointing out, I'm born in 1971. I'm a Generation X, came from the radical left. And I think it's important to put it in context that, you get out of the 70s and 80s and the left is really unified on freedom of speech. And by the left, I mean the radical left and the liberal left. So one of the most influential people on the radical left is this person, Noam Chomsky, who's a very famous critic of Israel. He's a famous anarchist, a linguist at MIT. And he's the one that would say that your commitment to free speech doesn't matter if it's not for everybody. He would also say he's Jewish. And so he would say, it's not the exact quote, but it would be a disservice of Holocaust, of people that died in the Holocaust to try to advocate for censorship in their name. And so it was always and he defended the right of a very famous Holocaust denier, I think a French guy named Farasani. He defended his right to publish, even though he, of course, disagreed with the books. And so the left in the 80s and 90s was very much committed to free speech. In 1989, which is the year that I graduated from high school, the Supreme Court ruled that people have a right to burn the American flag. It's not exactly speech, but it's freedom of expression. And it was conservatives who were on the other side of it. So free speech is a somewhat paradoxical one in the sense that I'm most well known for having changed my mind on some big issues. That's what my books are about, changing my mind about things on the environment and energy and homelessness and drugs. But my commitment to free speech, if anything, has only grown deeper over the years as I've gotten older and had to, in the last year and a half in particular, seen the censorship and seen this demand for free speech, felt more strongly about it than ever. I feel like if you lose free speech, then you're really immediately no longer a democracy. You're in a very different kind of totalitarian society.
In terms of your experiences talking about this subject, how passionate have the debates become? Have you had a lot of, attacks from your opponents in the mainstream media or the government or whatever? Like, what kind of opposition have you come up against?
Oh, absolutely. I think the first, we've written these heavy evidence-based articles and reports with, using, real emails and real documents. And so our opponents attack us and basically lie and say that we're spreading conspiracy theories. Well, we're revealing illegal and secretive efforts to violate the First Amendment. Those are not theories. These are proven conspiracies. But nonetheless, people attack us as conspiracy theorists. People say that I'm a right-winger or a Trump supporter, neither of which is true. I've never voted for Trump. I do not intend to vote for Trump. I made clear when I was in Brazil that I'm neither a fan of Bolsonaro or Trump. I consider my politics, I think my politics are very moderate, very liberal on some issues. I support civilization, which you might say is a conservative value. And then I find myself tapping more into my libertarian side in my defense of free speech. I think, I find myself in many situations having to make what I thought was a basic case for free speech. And so in Brazil, I found myself in a very impassioned argument, even raising my voice with a couple of journalists from the second largest newspaper who were saying to me, how can you be against censoring election disinformation? And I said, well, because if you get the government in the business of censoring election disinformation, how would you ever know if the government stole the election? You have to allow the disinformation to exist, and then you have to argue against it. The solution to disinformation is more free speech. The solution to false speech is true speech. So I have found myself a little bit surprised that how often I have to make and repeat what I think are very basic arguments for free speech that I learned when I was a child. But I think that tradition, whereas my father and others would tell these stories about free speech, because I think it's not intuitive for people, and arguably throughout history, it's not intuitive to understand that people should be allowed to say what they want, except for in very few circumstances. So I do find myself having to just sort of make what I think are elementary arguments for free speech, but I do find that people need to hear them. And it does make a difference when you make them.
And just finally on Britain, you mentioned Scotland earlier. Do you think Scotland has now got, a better chance at sort of having free speech on the internet, free speech obviously in person, because Youssef has gone. Can you just comment a little bit about the UK?
Well, I think what happened in Scotland, the most important thing that happened in Scotland was just that the First Minister was caught making very hateful remarks about white people, condemning Scotland as a racist country because there weren't enough non-whites in positions of power. But Scotland is over 95% white. And so he was making himself hateful arguments while demanding censorship of people for hate speech. I think that was a very important moment because I think people got to see that really the motivation for censorship is often hate. It's hate itself. It's hatred of other people's views. It's an intolerance of other people's views. I think we were able to see that with the Prime Minister, with the First Minister. I'm not saying it was the only reason he stepped down, but I do think it did contribute to his resignation.
Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate your time.
Great to be with you, Stephen.